The second of these officers, about this time, fired a pistol towards the militia as it was dispersing. The foremost, who was within a few yards of our men, brandishing his sword and then pointing towards them with a loud voice, said to the troops, "Fire, by God, fire!" which was instantly followed by a discharge of arms from the said troops, succeeding by a very heavy and close fire upon our party, dispersing so long as any of them were within reach. 8 were left dead upon the ground. 10 were wounded. The rest of the company, by divine goodness, were, to a miracle, preserved unhurt in this murderous action. As to the question, who fired first, if it can be a question with anyone, we may observe that though General Gage hath been pleased to tell the world in his account of this savage transaction that the troops were fired upon by the rebels out of the meeting house and the neighboring houses, as well as those that were in the field, and that the troops only returned the fire and passed on their way to Concord, yet nothing can be more certain than the contrary, and nothing more false, weak, or wicked than such a representation. To say nothing of the absurdity of the supposition that 50, 60, or even 70 men should, in the open field, commence hostilities with 12 or 1,500 of the best troops of Britain, nor of the known determination of this small party of Americans, upon no consideration whatsoever, to begin the scene of blood. A cloud of witnesses whose veracity cannot be justly disputed, under oath, have declared in the most express and positive terms that the British troops fired first. And I think we may safely add, without the least reason or provocation. Nor was there opportunity given for our men to have saved themselves, either by laying down their arms or dispersing as directed, had they been disposed to, as the command to fire upon them was given almost at the same time as they were ordered by the British officers to disperse and lay down their arms. In short, so far from firing first upon the king's troops, upon the more careful inquiry, it appears that but a few of our people fired at all, and even they did not fire until after being fired upon by the troops. They were wounded themselves, or saw others killed or wounded by them, and looked upon it next to impossible for them to escape. As to any firing from the meeting house, as Gage represents, it is certain that there were but 4 men in the meeting house when the troops came up, and they were then getting some ammunition from the town stock and had not so much as loaded their guns when the troops fired upon the militia. And as to the neighboring houses, it is equally certain that there was no firing from them, unless after the dispersion of our men, some who had fled to them for shelter might fire from them upon the troops. One circumstance more before the brigade quitted Lexington I beg leave to mention, as what may give a further specimen of the spirit and character of the officers and men of this body of troops. After the militia company were dispersed and the firing ceased, the troops drew up and formed in a body of the common, fired a volley and gave 3 huzzah by way of triumph and as expressive of the joy of victory and glory of conquest. Of this transaction I was a witness, having at all that time a fair view of their motions and being at the distance of not more than 70 or 80 rods from them. Whether this step was honorary to the detachment or agreeable to the rules of war, or how far it was expressive of bravery, heroism, and true military glory for 800 disciplined troops of Great Britain without notice or provocation to fall upon 60 or 70 undisciplined Americans who neither opposed nor molested them, and murder some and disperse the rest, and then to give the shout and make the triumph of victory, is not for me to determine, but must be submitted to the impartial world to judge. That there is a God with whom is the power and the glory and the victory is certain. But whether he will set his seal to the triumph made upon this most peculiar occasion by following it with further successes, and finally giving up this people into the hands of those that have thus cruelly commenced hostilities against them, must be left to time to discover. But to return from this digression, if it may be called a digression. Having thus vanquished the party in Lexington, the troops marched on for Concord to execute their orders in destroying the stores belonging to the colony deposited there. They met with no interruption in their march to Concord, but by some means or other, the people of Concord had noticed of their approach and designs and were alarmed about break of day, and collecting as soon as it may be possible, improved the time they had before the troops came upon them to best advantage, both for concealing and securing as many of the public stores as they could, and in preparing for defense. By the stop of the troops at Lexington, many thousands were saved to the colony, and they were in great measure frustrated in their design. When the troops made their approach to the easterly part of the town, the provincials of Concord and some neighboring towns were collecting in an advantageous post on a hill of a little distance from the meeting house north of the road, to the number of about 150 or 200. But finding the troops to be more than 3 times as many, they wisely retreated, first to a hill about 80 rods further north, and then over to the North Bridge, about a mile from town. And there they waited the coming of the militia of the towns adjacent to their assistance. In the meantime, the British detachment marched into the center of the town. A party of about 250 was ordered to take possession of the bridge. Other parties were dispatched to various parts of the town to search for public stores, while the remainder were employed in seizing and destroying whatever they could find in the townhouse and other places where stores had been lodged. But before they had accomplished their design, they were interrupted by a discharge of arms at said bridge. It seems that of the party above mentioned as ordered to take possession of the bridge, one half marched on about 2 miles in search of stores at Colonel Barrett's in that part of town, while the other half, consisting of towards 100 men under Captain Laurie, were left to guard the bridge. The provincials who were inside of the bridge, observing the troops attempting to take the planks of the said bridge, thought it necessary to dislodge them and gain possession of the bridge. They accordingly marched, but with express orders not to fire unless first fired upon by the king's troops. Upon their approach towards the bridge, Captain Laurie's party fired upon them, killed Captain Davis and another man dead on the spot, and wounded several others. Upon this, our militia rushed on with a spirit becoming freeborn Americans, returned the fire upon the enemy, killed 2, wounded several, and drove them from the bridge and pursued them toward town till they were covered by a reinforcement from the main body. The provincials then took post on a hill at some distance north of town, and as their numbers were continually increasing, they were preparing to give the troops a proper discharge of their departure from the town. In the meantime, the king's troops collected, and having dressed their wounded, destroyed what stores they could find, and insulted and plundered a number of the inhabitants prepared for a retreat. The troops began a hasty retreat about the middle of the day, and were no sooner out of town, but they began to meet the effects of the just resentments of this injured people. The provincials fired upon them from various quarters and pursued them with a firmness and intrepidity beyond what could have been expected on the first onset, and in such a day of confusion and distress. The fire was returned for a time with great fury by the troops as they retreated, but with little execution. This scene continued, but with little intermission, till they returned to Lexington, when it was evident that, having lost numbers in killed, wounded, and prisoners that fell into our hands, they began to not only be fatigued, but greatly disheartened. And as it was supposed, they must have surrendered at discretion had they not been reinforced. But Lord Percy's arrival with another brigade of about 1,000 men and 2 field pieces about a half mile from Lexington meeting house towards Cambridge gave them a seasonable respite. The coming of the reinforcement with the cannon put the provincials also to a pause for a time. But no sooner were the king's troops in motion, but our men renewed the pursuit with equal and even greater ardor and intrepidity than before, and the firing on both sides continued with but little intermission to the close of the day, when the troops entered Charlestown, where the provincials could not follow them without exposing the worthy inhabitants of that truly patriotic town to their rage and revenge. That night and the next day they were conveyed in boats over Charles River to Boston, glad to secure themselves under the cover of the shipping, and by strengthening and perfecting their fortifications at every part against further attacks of a justly incensed people, who upon intelligence of the murderous transactions of this fatal day were collecting in arms round the town in great numbers and from every quarter. In the retreat of the king's troops from Concord to Lexington, they ravaged and plundered as they had opportunity, more or less, in most of the houses that were upon the road. But after they were joined by Percy's brigade in Lexington, it seemed as if all the little remains of humanity had left them, and rage and revenge had taken the reins and knew no bounds. Clothing, furniture, provisions, goods, plundered, broken, carried off, destroyed, buildings, especially dwelling houses, abused, defaced, battered, shattered, and almost ruined. And as this had not been enough, numbers of them doomed to the flames. 3 dwelling houses, 2 shops, and a barn were laid in ashes in Lexington. Many others were set on fire in this town, in Cambridge, etc., and must have shared the same fate had not the close pursuit of the provincials prevented and the flames been seasonably quenched. Add to all this, the unarmed and aged and infirmed who were unable to flee are inhumanely stabbed and murdered in their habitations. Yea, even women in childbed with the helpless babes in arms do not escape the horrid alternative to being either cruelly murdered in their beds, burnt in their habitations, or turned into the streets to perish with cold, nakedness, and distress.